This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and for those of you keeping track, this is Chapter 9 of Volume 4 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers, written around 1910-ish. And it's all true, factual, sordid American history that you are not supposed to know about. Chapter 9. Morgan as a banking and railroad grandee. Good old J.P. Morgan. On January 2nd, 1889, a circular marked, quote, private and confidential, unquote, was issued by the three banking houses of Drexel, Morgan and Company, Brown Brothers and Company, and Kidder, Peabody and Company. The most painstaking care was exercised that this document should not find its way into the press or otherwise become public. Indeed, extraordinary measures were taken to surround its contents with every precaution of secrecy. Why this fear? Because the circular was an invitation tacitly understood as a command to the great railroad magnates to assemble at Morgan's house. Boy, this is interesting, folks. Let me pause there. This book is written around 1910, 3 years before they pulled off the Federal Reserve fraud. And here, Gustavus Myers in 1910 records that it was already a practice of the super elite, super rich folks to meet in secret, just like they did 3 years after this book came out at Jekyll Island, to meet in secret without the press knowing about it. Wonderful. Wait till Jesus gets hold of these unredeemed rich men on Judgment Day. Okay, that's fascinating, though. You already see the pattern, though, the pattern of meeting in secret. They did it in 1889. Okay. The plan was made. Okay, getting back now. Because the circular was an invitation, tacitly understood as a command to the great railroad magnates to assemble at Morgan's house, number 219 Madison Avenue. Of course it'd be Madison Avenue. And there form, in the phrase of the day, an ironclad combination. The plan was to make a strict compact which would efface competition among certain railroads and unite those interests in an agreement by which the people of the United States could be bled even more effectively than before. For the sake of appearance, in case the nature of the undertaking should leak into public print, the promoters garnished over their real purposes with a string of diverting phrases. Their sole aim, so they pleasantly indicted it, was an association, quote, to maintain public, reasonable, uniform, and stable rates, unquote. Yeah, right. And they added that another object would be the gathering of statistics regarding railways. Such subterfuges deceived nobody but the credulous or uninformed, like your local 501c3 hireling shepherd pastor. Historic meeting in Morgan's house. That circular is a historic document, well worth more than passing notice. And he who is familiar with the forces then at work will rightly consider it of far greater importance than president's messages, ordainments of Congress, or court's decrees. At a time when the whole gravamen of law and juridical precedent was being used to insist upon industrial forces remaining stationary and stagnant, This circular came as a proclamation of defiance. Common and statute law sternly declared that the thing called competition in trade must be kept alive, and that if it could not sustain itself by its own merits, the law should demand its maintenance. The causes producing and justifying competition were passing away, but none of the law-making bodies recognized the newer conditions nor made any provisions for them. But the magnates realized that the old indiscriminate system of competition was rapidly becoming archaic, and that the time was ripe for a more systematic organization of industry. Here it comes, monopoly capitalism, folks, what we have now and are suffering from. And so, while Congress and the legislatures were busily enacting law after law, supposedly edicts of, quote, the sovereign people of the United States, unquote. Ooh, look at that. In the United States, the U is not capitalized in Gustavus Myers' book. Fascinating. So while that was going on, a few magnates issued a brief circular which intrinsically was of far, far more binding weight than entire volumes of statutes, impotent in the long run in the face of onrushing economic forces. But the ideas of the people at large and the self-interest of the middle class were against any overthrow of the competitive system. Tone their statement of purposes down, as the magnates did, and however harmless they might represent their aims, the plan of this group of bankers and railroad grandees was certain to arouse the sharpest suspicions. A restless, sullen state of mind pervaded the mass of people. Distrustful of any assertions made by the magnates, they were ever ready to see sinister projects beneath bland announcements. Furthermore, the magnates' definition of quote-unquote reasonable was diametrically different from that of the people at large. Matters and charges that the magnates honeyed over as, quote, reasonable adjustments, unquote, impressed the popular understanding as extremely unreasonable, as gross extortions of which the law should take condign notice, wrecking the middle class gradually. At the behest of the middle class, laws directed, superficially at least, against the magnates' arbitrary power and concentration of resources were everywhere being passed. Since the putting down and dissolution of the great labor movement of 1886, serious inroads from that quarter were no longer feared. But the work of extinguishing the middle class had to be proceeded with slowly and discreetly. Workers' uprising, political or other, could be crushed by force and court decrees and by bribery and fraud at the polls. In any emergency, the whole middle class would stand with the great propertied interests in subduing the working class. Yet, when the fight for supremacy was one confined to the middle class and the plutocracy, the magnates had good reason not to attack the middle class too openly. The country swarmed with organizations of manufacturers, jobbers, and small tradesmen. And in the West and South, the Farmers' Alliance, an ally, was at its strongest. This middle class arrogated to itself the distinction of being, quote-unquote the public. The working class, whom it used and exploited, had only a few obscure trade journals to disseminate its views and voice its demands, and, although comprising the immense bulk of the voters, had not a single real representative in political office. But the interests of the middle class were represented by thousands of newspapers and journals. Used to be, right? By a host of political spokesmen and lawyers and college professors, and by the force of prevalent law and commercial institutions. In warring upon the magnates, the most persistent argument that the middle class used in its appeal for sympathy and support was that the extortions of the magnates were immoral. Precisely as, when the working men in previous decades had struck for a shortening of their hours of daily labor, the manufacturers had declared the movement insurrectionary and immoral. So now they used the same plea against the exactions of the magnates. When the workers complained that their bosses oppressed them, the bosses retaliated with the charge that the working men were unruly, and that their demands for redress were not based on morality. But when the magnates squeezed the manufacturers, jobbers, and retailers, then these divisions of the middle class made vehement lamentations that they were the victims of an immoral conspiracy. Nothing could exceed the baseness and hypocrisy of the middle class as a class. It demanded the widest latitude in law in placing no restrictions upon it, either in exploiting its employees or in robbing back from them in various swindling ways the meager wages it paid. It insistently fought the workers' struggle for a shorter workday and more wages. It opposed the passage of even slight laws for the protection of the workers' labor. It combated movements for factory and tenement reforms. At the same time, it insisted upon its right to make and sell shoddy goods and adulterated products, and impose them upon the workers at extortionate prices. The many laws which, after strong agitation on the part of labor organizations and various other bodies, the different legislatures were passing at this time, indicate the widespread practice of manufacturing and selling adulterated and often poisonous foods and drugs. The passage of these laws had long been contested by the capitalist class as a whole. And even after they were enacted, they were not generally enforced, and were so ineffective that many years later, during Roosevelt's administration, a National Pure Food Act was passed by Congress after the severest and most persistent opposition on the part of the beneficiaries of the frauds. This law also has been largely ineffective. In 1879, Wisconsin enacted a penal law providing penalties for the adulteration of foods and drugs. Ohio, in 1887, 1896, and 1898, passed laws for the punishment of various kinds of adulteration. New York, in 1893 and 1898, passed laws forbidding the fraudulent sale of certain imitation foods and certain fraudulent stamped goods. After years of agitation, Massachusetts in 1897 passed a law prohibiting the manufacture or sale of adulterated food. Missouri in 1889 and 1897 passed laws against the adulteration of certain foods. Iowa enacted laws for the punishment of those selling adulterated milk, cheese, butter, and linseed oil. Illinois in 1881 passed a law against the fraudulent manufacture or sale of imitation butter and linseed oil. New Jersey in the same year passed an act to prevent the adulteration of foods and drugs and enacted another law in 1897. Pennsylvania prohibited the sale of adulterated drugs and provided penalties for the adulteration of milk and cream. Michigan, in 1895, passed an act to prohibit and prevent adulteration, fraud, and deception in the manufacture and sales of articles of food and drink. Nebraska and Kentucky passed similar laws. South Dakota, in 1885, enacted penal laws relating to the adulteration of food and drink, and in 1897 passed another act increasing the penalties. These are some examples of the various state laws. Nearly all of the states also passed laws against the sale by fraudulent weights and measures of coal, wheat, and various other foods and commodities. Characteristics of the magnate's critics. Not a move, on the other hand, could the magnates make without the middle class raising the cry of fraud. A not untrue accusation, it is hardly necessary to say, but one singularly ill-chosen from a class itself gangrened with fraud. The Farmers' Alliance and kindred organizations virtuously fulminated against the extortion and frauds of the magnate class. The cattle dealers of the Southwest, especially, were not merely bitter, but rancorously so, against the railroad kings. Yet all of the large cattle ranches had been obtained by fraud in more or less degree. The cattlemen not only practiced extortions, but in their economic wars with adjacent cattlemen, forced their cowboys to fight and kill the cowboys of their neighbors, and risk being killed themselves. Nearly all of those cowboy affrays, so romantically described in fiction, arose from nothing more or less than economic disputes between competing rival master cattlemen. To say that the entire manufacturing class was defrauding and swindling in every conceivable form is but to state a truism elaborated upon specifically in many a public document. Leaving aside the current stupendous frauds in profiting from misleading, semi-worthless merchandise or adulterated products sold under false pretenses, a traffic shared in by wholesaler, jobber, and retailer. Aside from this phase and a multitude of other phases, we shall simply give one typical graphic example of what the manufacturers were doing in one of the largest manufacturing states in the Union. While protesting against the evasion of taxation by the railroad corporations, the manufacturers were defrauding in the one item of taxation alone of a sum gigantic in the aggregate. Reported Comptroller Morgan of New York State in 1900, quote, "It is a notorious fact that hundreds of manufacturing companies whose plants are located in this state, whose business is chiefly transacted here, and which for all practical purposes are New York enterprises, escape all indirect taxation in this state, and much local taxation, by being incorporated in other states, unquote. They paid substantially nothing for fire and police protection, Comptroller Morgan added. Yet, in case their employees struck, these manufacturers were ever ready to requisition the pretext of violence and demand police and militia to club or shoot into submission the very working class from whose labor the entire burden of taxation came. This had been a long continuing condition of affairs in every state. Morgan directs matters. These facts will give a fairly clear idea of the composition and pretensions of that middle class which the news of the meeting in Morgan's house was bound to excite into convulsions. A momentous gathering it certainly was that assembled in Morgan's mansion on January 8, 1889. Who are they we note there? Apparently private citizens, in reality monarchs of the land. Jay Gould, with his son George, held by the leading strings. Stickney of the Northwest Territory, Roberts of the Pennsylvania Railroad, sleek Depew echoing the Vanderbilts, Sloan of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, and a half-dozen more magnates or their accredited mouthpieces. The honorable legislatures could gravely discuss the advisability of this or that legislation. The noisy Congress of the United States could solemnly meet, and after wearing out months in rhodomontade, I have no idea what rhodomontade? Profess to make laws. The high and mighty courts could blink austerely and pompously hand down their decisions. But in that room in Morgan's house sat many of the actual rulers of the United States. The men who had the power in the final say of ordering what should be done. Wow, this is over a century ago, folks. Well, no, it's about a century ago. And Gustavus Myers is telling you, even then, 100 years ago, who the real rulers of this country are. And they have nothing to do with the frauds, charlatans that you vote for, that you foolishly vote for. Those are puppets. He tells you it was so a century ago. And what do you think it is today? Morgan was chairman of the meeting, and with wonted brusque directness went straight to the point. Thanks to a stenographic report of the proceedings, which fortunately we have been able to get hold of, the work of that meeting is clear. The name of the organization was to be the, quote, Interstate Commerce Railway Commission, unquote. Its essential purpose, the cessation of competition among its members. Folks, in 1889, if you think that these oligarchs were meeting in secret, away from the press, to agree to do away with competition in the railroads, don't you think 30 years later they were more than capable of it? I mean, they were fully ripe to meet in secret to discuss the doing away of competition having to do with money changing in the formation of the Federal Reserve. This book makes this history so much more clear now. Back to the book. But how was any magnate to be prevented from competing with one another, or stopped from encroaching upon another's domain? What penalties should there be, and how could they be enforced? Certainly no law could be invoked to compel the carrying out of such an agreement, for the law explicitly prohibited combinations, and any legislation would not only be outlawed, but would reveal the extent of the whole criminal compact. He delivers a mandate. There was, however, a far greater power than that of law, namely, the power of massed money. If any magnate present were inclined to balk at the prepared program, he was brought to an instant realization of the punishment when Morgan announced, quote, "I am authorized to say, I think, on behalf of the banking houses represented here, that if an organization can be formed practically upon the basis submitted by the committee, and with an executive committee able to enforce its provisions, upon which the bankers shall be represented, they are prepared to say that they will not negotiate and will do everything in their power to prevent the negotiation of any securities for the construction of parallel lines, or the extension of lines not approved by that executive committee. I wish that distinctly understood," unquote. The threat or promise, as it could be differently interpreted, was assuredly understood. Vast as was the wealth of the magnates present or represented, neither any one or combination of them dared, had they been so disposed, to defy such an ultimatum. To do so meant inviting the vindictive, crushing wrath and international bankers whose money and power could be used with the most destructive results. Nor was there any possible way of appealing to a higher power. What if many of the state legislatures had penalized combinations in restraint of trade? What if the irate middle class was frantically clamoring for the enforcement of these laws? What if, in both common and statute law, this coercive decree of the bankers was criminal conspiracy? Every man in that assemblage knew that, judged by prevailing laws, he was participating in a conspiracy. Yet no apprehension was acutely felt that the numerous national and state laws would be strictly enforced against him. So confident of its ground was the meeting, that the subject of possible prosecution was not given a thought. The sacred doctrine, the, quote, inalienable, undeprivable right, unquote, of competition was, without any ambiguity or ceremony, given a deadly blow. For that, if for no other reason, the meeting was memorable. The magnates were sure of immunity. To them, laws were instruments, not obstacles. The same code of laws which they lightly stamped underfoot, they could always successfully use against working men on strike, as they did, for example, 5 years later, in the great railroad strike of 1894, when federal troops were ordered out at their command to overawe and, if necessary, mow down the strikers. Another phase of that meeting, parentheses, a quote-unquote conference, as it was called, in parentheses, deserves mention here. How much of a vacuity men were considered, magnates though they were, and how all-important property was held, was shown by the method of voting. As each proposition was advanced, it was put to a vote. The names of the magnates were not mentioned in the roll call. It was the corporate railroads which were expected to vote and which did vote. Thus, instead of Gould's name, the name of his railroads was called. The Missouri Pacific and the Wabash voted, not Gould. What could have been more beautifully simple and direct, so free from cant, so faithful to the spirit of the human money bags present? If this method were only adopted in Congress, much good in point of popular understanding would result. For while the old forms there still persist, most of our quote-unquote statesmen would not be libeled were the roll call made by corporations instead of by putative representatives of the people. This is 100 years ago, folks. Literally 100 years ago this was written. And Gustavus Myers is telling you that the corporations run this nation. How much more so do you think this is the case now? Those of you who have an entire set of faculties. Okay. If a mere threat of the powerful bankers led by Morgan was enough to convince or overawe a group of the railroad dictators of the United States, what could not the banking power accomplish when it actively concentrated its might of money upon a given object? Neither capitalist foe nor any government could withstand it. The extremes to which it could go in successfully executing its plans and in dissipating all obstacles by its terrorism was typically shown in a noted bond deal in 1895, whereby the United States government was held up by a syndicate of bankers headed by Morgan and forced to give over a virtual gift of many millions of dollars for the privilege of having a nominal and transient claim on a supply of gold which those same bankers had drained from the United States Treasury only a short time previously. The Wall Street view of Morgan. Before describing this transaction, a digression will be made to chronicle some intervening facts in Morgan's career. His father died in 1890, bequeathing to him a fortune superficially estimated at $10 million. But it is needless to say that J. Pierpont Morgan was already a seignorial multimillionaire, that he was intensely hated by a large portion of the element in the financial district was undeniable, but it was a hatred caused not by objection to his methods, but because he eminently surpassed in either the brutality or finesse of those methods. All of his decriers of his own rank had at basis some personal grievance, resolving itself into a rankling enmity at being outwitted or outdone by Morgan. Had he given them the slightest opening, they would have enmeshed and swindled him and gloated over the deed. But with the exception of one distinguished antagonist, to whom we will refer later, he anticipated and overcame them all, and left many of them with the embittered memory of their collision with him, but with nothing more substantial. No doubt Morgan's personality had much to do with this current hatred on the part of those who came into contact with him. He was at no time to be suspected of being of the unctuous order of men, full of blandishments and sweetened guile. Rather, he was a sort of plug ugly in the financial purlius, belligerent and ruthless, with a rough, dictatorial manner, unsparing of the feelings or interests of those who in any way crossed his will or plans. Those personal details, however, were not known to the great mass of the people the country over. The popular conception of men in public notice was derived almost wholly from what the newspapers said, fools, and these constantly, with rare departures, portrayed Morgan as a great financier and benevolent gentleman. In Morgan's financial transactions, immense numbers of the middle class, as well as people higher in the scale of the well-to-do, lost, in the aggregate, great sums of money torn from them in the stock-jobbing operations in Wall Street. But they did not blame Morgan personally. Their bitterness was cast at the generic monster called Wall Street. And yet, not a single one of those thus stripped had not deliberately set out to enrich himself at someone else's expense. You can't cheat an honest man. Even those who put their funds in stocks for the purposes of, quote, legitimate investment, unquote, did so with the full knowledge that the lower the wages paid on the railroads and in the factories, and the longer the daily labor of the workers, the brighter were the chances for a larger dividend. At the same time, while hated in the financial district, Morgan was deeply feared for his far-reaching power, and what were considered his relentless methods both in accomplishing his ends and in settling scores. Observers usually described him, in the slang of Wall Street, as a man who was in business, quote, for all there is in it, unquote, as though anyone else were in Wall Street for a different purpose. His policy was regarded as that of finding a weak spot in a corporation and then, quote, squeezing it for all it was worth, unquote. A very much biased accusation, inasmuch as every other successful financier incontrovertibly pursued the same methods, although not always in the same way. His favorite expression, when questioned about his transactions, was, quote, I am not in Wall Street for my health, unquote. His enemies whispered about that he was, quote, a freebooter in finance, unquote. His admirers, those who profited by his bounty, loudly proclaimed his greatness. All right, we're going to learn a little bit more about this dirtbag named J.P. Morgan when we come back. Okay, we're back, continuing now with Chapter 9 of Volume 4 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. He, Morgan, comes to the front as a coal magnate. Of Morgan's methods in seizing, in conjunction with William Vanderbilt, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad from McLeod in 1893, we have already given a description. In that account it was shown how, when McLeod pressingly needed funds, both to finance his railroad's coal combination and to pay for improvements, he found that the leading banking institutions had impaired and then cut off his credit. Morgan and Vanderbilt were then able to assault and beat down the price of the Reading stock, buy large quantities of it at a very low figure, and gain control of the system. As a railroad, the reading line was not extensive. Its great value lay in its ownership of the anthracite coal mines, of vast unmined deposits, and in its coal-carrying traffic. To his other manifold powers, Morgan now added that of a coal magnate. The Constitution of Pennsylvania, as we have seen, expressly forbade railroad corporations from owning and operating coal mines. But that law did not exist, which the very rich were not able to evade. Dummy holding companies were organized, and although everybody knew that these companies were mere subterfuges, the public authorities took no action. And when, after many years of inactivity, they, with indifferent energy, brought suit, the case was appealed by the magnates to the Supreme Court of the United States, from which, in 1909, the railroads emerged victorious, with a decision of so equivocal a nature as to be tantamount to one in their favor. Two immediate results signalized Morgan's entry as a monarch of the coal fields. To both we have adverted in a previous chapter, but they will here bear repetition. Every housekeeper using hard coal was taxed to add more millions to Morgan's fortune. The price of stove coal was raised from $1.25 to $1.35 more a ton than had been charged before. The second result was the more rapid process of crushing out the independent coal operators. By a concatenation of ruthless methods, these independents were ruined and driven out, not without much wailing against oppression and shrill charges of fraud. Yet the very mines which they were virtually coerced into giving up had been secured by fraud, either by them or by their predecessors. The law records of the state of Pennsylvania reveal case after case, before and after the Civil War, of fraudulent tax sales of lands containing coal, and the bribery of the Pennsylvania legislature by individuals and corporations for coal mining and other kinds of charters and special rights had been so admittedly brazen that, in 1847, the legislature, with a self-righteous display, was constrained to pass an act to define and punish the offense of bribery, making the crime of giving or receiving a bribe a felony, punishable with a fine not exceeding $5,000 or a sentence of 5 years in prison. This law was treated with levity. It had no other effect than to refine and obscure the methods of bribery. Another act was passed on March 3rd, 1860, and a third on April 29th, 1874, which laws were likewise facetiously regarded by the seekers of vested privileges, and the bribery went on persistently. Time after time, the legislature of Pennsylvania was forced to appoint investigating committees to report on this or that charge that bribes had been used. One of the few times when any of the bribed ever went to prison was in the riot indemnity bill trials in 1879 to 1880. Some excuse was needed to give the appearance of a necessity for the great increase in the price of coal. The coal magnates supplied it beforehand. They inquired how they could avoid charging more. Had not the production of coal fallen? Folks, this is the exact same thing that is going on with the price of gas today. It's the same, the mirror image same. It's just a repeat of history, a repeat of fraud. Had not the production of coal fallen? Had not the production of oil fallen? Had not the price of gas? And were not the freight rates extremely high? But the government knew that these claims were fabrications. The House Committee on Interstate Commerce had unanimously reported that the coal magnates had deliberately reduced the output of coal. Yep. That although the capacity of the collieries was 50 million tons a year, yet only about 40 million tons were being mined, so as to make a show of scarcity. There it is. And as regards freight rates for coal, the committee reported, quote, although coal in freight can be handled cheaper than almost any class of freight, yet it pays nearly double the rate of wheat and cotton, unquote. Without quibble, this combination was a conspiracy, criminally and civilly liable. But neither national nor state law was enforced against it. The House Committee reported that the Interstate Commerce Act was too ineffective a law to proceed under, and that ended talk of criminal prosecution. The government machinery of the United States practically became, as it did in so many other instances, an accessory of the coal combination in allowing it to squeeze more huge extortions from the sufferings of the mass of the people. The boasted government, quote, of for and by the people, unquote, was a government run wholly by the great propertied interests as a necessary appendage, based upon force, for compelling the people to submit without redress or quarter. Wow. Such operations as this explain how Morgan's fortunes leaped by millions at a time. Every dollar extorted in that increase of price came very largely from families who, already burdened by 1,001 extortions, were forced to suffer still more keenly. How about that proverb, rob not the rich, rob not from the poor, rob not the poor man, or God's going to get you later on. Each new compression from above drove them deeper into abject poverty, with all its demoralizing and horrible evils. The whole edifice of capitalism was built on a vast, ghastly charnel house, overcrowded with the bones of numberless victims. Wow! Oh, wow, what an indictment. And yet from what he's described in horrid detail all throughout this book up to this point, can you possibly take issue with that? No. He's built his case, has Myers. Yet the industrial grandees who thus slaughtered with impunity in the insidious ways of trade paraded themselves as very devout men. Morgan was a vestryman of St. George's Church, New York City, and ostentatiously passed the contribution plate in the name of Christ. Well, he's not going to fool Christ on Judgment Day. To this coal transaction of Morgan's, there is a sequel showing how and by what methods he expanded as a coal dictator. But the recounting of this will be deferred to its proper chronological place, and that famous bond deal of his in 1895 will be considered. transferring great railroad systems. The two Drexel partners of his, Frank and Anthony Drexel, passed away, each leaving an estate of $25 million. They, too, had acquired the glorious name of philanthropists. Before dying, they had together given away the sum of $8 million to found sundry charitable institutions in or near Philadelphia. Since their partnership with Morgan, they had, of course, shared in all of his transactions. Some of these we shall have to pass over with only a reference, inasmuch as the facts are exceedingly involved. But this one point sticks out. Great railroad systems, in the building of which neither Morgan nor his associates had in the slightest participated, which had been constructed largely with public funds and gifts of public land, and which they had never seen until long after they were in operation, these railroads suddenly passed into the ownership of the Morgan Combine, which largely meant Morgan. How did this transformation come about? Shall we have to retell the old story, the original looting, the bankruptcies, reorganizations, and tricks of finance, squeezing out of creditors and small stockholders? However glib financial writers may attempt to explain it, or with whatever fine phrases apologists might gloss it over, the matter reduces itself to this trenchant fact, that Morgan became possessed of great railroad systems in the South, with the initiation and operation of which he had had no more to do than a babe. The Industrial Commission reported these railroads as being in the quote-unquote Morgan Group by 1901. The Southern Railway, with its 6,807 miles of track, the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, the Queen and Crescent, the Central of Georgia, later taken over by Harriman, the Georgia Southern and Florida, the Macon and Birmingham, the Philadelphia and Reading, the Lehigh Valley, the Erie, subsequently acquired by Harriman, the Central of New Jersey, and the Atlantic Coast Line. The total extent of these railroads was 19,073 miles. Compared to the tortuous and difficult details of Morgan's quote-unquote reorganizations, the tale of his United States bond transaction of 1895 is simple enough to be easily comprehended. As gold was the international trade standard of value, the United States government followed the policy of holding a certain amount as a treasury reserve. When, by reason of some cause or other, this reserve was depleted, the government was compelled to issue bonds to replenish it. The powerful junta of leading national and international bankers definitely and deliberately forced the United States government to put out these bond issues. This they did by draining the treasury of its gold, and by then going through the empty form of selling back that gold in return for bonds. The treasury notes and greenbacks, comprising much of the currency of the United States government, were redeemable in coin. This provision was construed as calling for payment in gold. The bankers would take over to the sub-treasury in New York City great stacks of treasury notes and greenbacks and exchange them for gold. This gold they would then hoard in their vaults. The government authorities were fully aware of this proceeding and knew quite well that the ulterior purpose was to force a bond issue. After the banking clique had obtained the bonds, it could do two things: sell large amounts of them at enhanced premiums to smaller banks, savings banks, insurance companies, estates, and investors in general, and it could use such portion of the issue that is kept as a basis for issuing new currency. The large private bankers, such as Morgan, had their chain of auxiliary national banks, by means of which bond issues could be converted into currency, and the time-honored extortion of getting a double interest could be managed, quote-unquote, milking the government. In 1894, the government had been drawn into handing over two bond issues of $50 million each to these bankers. Their profits, it is estimated, reached tens of millions. With the advent of the year 1895, the United States Treasury was again emptied of gold. Where had the gold, which the government had purchased only a short time previously at usurious rates, gone? The reports of the large banks gave the answer. By the end of January, 26 banks in New York City had in their vaults a hoard of $65 million in gold. Presently, the amount totaled $129 million all told. The government shrieked in helplessness. President Cleveland was reported as saying privately that, quote, "the banks have got the country by the throat," unquote. At the appropriate moment, a syndicate of bankers appeared in the open and magnanimously offered to supply gold to the government in exchange for bonds. This syndicate was composed of J.P. Morgan and Company, August Belmont and Company, the usual suspects, right, representing the Rothschilds, James Speyer, the National City Bank, and 4 other extremely powerful national banks. In the negotiations with President Cleveland for the bond issue, Morgan's emissary and clever man of law was Francis Lynd Stetson, who had been regular counsel for Morgan since 1887. Stetson had been Jacob Sharp's attorney at the very time when, in 1884, Sharp had bribed the New York Board of Aldermen with $500,000 to give him a franchise for a surface railroad in Broadway. His activities in Sharp's transactions caused him to be subjected to some severe questioning in 1886 by the New York State Senate Committee on the Broadway Railroad. After Sharp had successfully bribed the New York aldermen, Elkins and Widener, who were likewise bribing the Philadelphia Common Council and the Pennsylvania legislature, and who became multi-millionaire street railway magnates, tried, although for the time unsuccessfully, to lease the Broadway Railroad for a term of 999 years, and, as an earnest of good faith, deposited 10,000 shares of Broadway stock, which they had secured with Drexel, Morgan and Company. Morgan knew that every one of these shares was the product of bribery, and that the whole Broadway franchise had been so obtained. Perhaps Stetson's excellent and adroit work for Sharp highly commended him to Morgan. After Cleveland had been defeated in his candidacy in 1888 for a second term as President of the United States, he resumed the practice of law and formed a partnership with Stetson. Cleveland was re-elected president in 1892. Thereafter, Stetson was a frequent and confidential caller at the White House. These various circumstances were much commented upon, and with particular animadversion. I'm going to have to get a thesaurus, a really good and thorough thesaurus, to look up several of these words from this book. Animadversion. Wow. When Cleveland was virtually charged in 1895 with openly selling out the people of the United States to the Morgan Syndicate, represented by Stetson. 18 millions as a gift. The situation then was this. The syndicate had squeezed the United States Treasury of its gold. It had then compelled a bond issue and declared that it alone could supply the required gold. This was a transparent falsehood. Many members of Congress urged Cleveland and John G. Carlyle, Secretary of the Treasury, to make the bond issue a quote-unquote popular one. By quote-unquote popular was not meant the mass of the people who had neither gold nor other kind of money, but from the smaller capitalist interests. Cleveland and Carlyle, however, turned over the $62 million of 4% bonds to the Morgan Syndicate at the price of $104. The syndicate immediately resold the bonds to investors in America and in Europe at $118, $119, and $120, clearing, it was estimated, in direct profits about $18 million. This sum represented the sum that would have gone to the government had the sale of bonds been accomplished without this intermediary operation. The contract with the government, entirely dictated by the bankers, headed by Morgan, gave the syndicate, furthermore, an operation on all bond issues up to October 1st following, and allowed it to choose its own time to deliver 1/2 of the total amount in gold. From every public quarter came the severest denunciations of Cleveland on the one hand, and Morgan on the other. Even partisan newspapers and periodical supporters of Cleveland condemned the bargain as scandalous, and declared that the government had been shamelessly, quote-unquote, buncoed, if indeed no worse charge could be brought against its chief executive. His own political party repudiated Cleveland, but a significant insight into the indifference with which the great magnates viewed storms of criticism was furnished by the fact that Morgan ignored the denunciation of his acts, yet deeply and openly resented a published description of himself as a, quote, ruby-visaged magnate, unquote. He was very sensitive as to his facial deformities. So far as strictures on his acts went, they soon passed away, and the very journals which had been foremost in verbally flaying him reverted to their old sycophantic policy of extolling him as an illustrious financier and philanthropist. Of all the magnates, none had a more biting contempt for the newspapers than Morgan. None knew better than he that whatever outbreak they might occasionally make, their course, on the whole, could easily be controlled by the great propertied interests. Nothing for the unemployed. To realize, however, the full import of the action of the government in this particular bond sale, by which a present of fully $18 million was made to a few bankers already surfeited with wealth, it is necessary to recall the conditions among the mass of people, especially after the panic of 1893. In normal times, according to the estimate of Carroll D. Wright, for some years, United States Labor Commissioner, the number of unemployed at any one time was about 1 million, men, women, and children. After the panic of 1893, the number reached perhaps 3 million. Not a finger was lifted by the government in the aid of any of these, nor was the remotest consideration given to means for alleviating this misery or to the causes producing it. Repressive measures were used to suppress street meetings of protest, and the leaders of labor unions were flung into prison on the alleged charge of contempt of the federal courts. Only the year before, in 1894, the regular army had been ordered out by Cleveland against the railroad working men on strike. This country has a long history of ordering out the regular army against we the little people. It goes all the way back to George Washington and the Whiskey Rebellion, Shays Rebellion. And it was going on in the 50s in California. And you think Alex Jones has found something new, that ravening wolf, bombastic Alex Jones? No. Nowhere and in no respect did government do other than carry out the demands made by the great capitalists who dominated all of its functions. Wow, what a sordid tale our real history of this nation is. Okay, folks, this has been Chapter 9 of Volume 4 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. Thanks for listening. Over and out.